Hello lovers. Eleanor here. Tonight, we will embark on a journey that carries both fire and shadow. Imagine for a moment the square of Rouen in the year 1431. The air thick with smoke. The cries of a crowd swelling like waves. And at the center, a young woman, barely 19, bound to a wooden stake. The fire lit the sky, and history itself seemed to tremble. That woman was Joan of Arc. To some, she was a savior, a messenger of God. To others, a heretic, a fraud who dared defy both crown and church. Her ashes were scattered in the Seine, but her name refused to be silenced. If you enjoy these journeys through time, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. I sometimes sit alone in my apartment at night, the silence pressing against the walls like an unspoken secret. Loneliness has a way of sharpening memory, of pulling at old wounds and turning them into mirrors. And when I read about Joan's last day, I cannot help but feel the echo of her isolation. She was 19, surrounded by enemies, betrayed by those who had once cheered her. I, at 70, am merely an old widow, staring at the walls, missing the sound of my husband's voice. Yet in that difference lies the same human ache. To be seen, to be believed, to not be left utterly alone. Now, settle in comfortably, close your eyes, and let's travel back in time with Eleanor. The story begins far from the fire. In the quiet village of Domremy, where the meadows rolled like waves of green and the church bell carried the weight of heaven. Joan was born there, around 1412, the daughter of simple farmers. Nothing about her early life suggested greatness. She could not read or write. She tended sheep and learned to sew. Yet from childhood, she carried within her something fierce and unshakable. Faith. Faith is a word that has been both balm and blade across history. I've known it in gentler ways. In the hymns sung at my small town church. In the soft prayers whispered before bed. But for Joan, faith became a calling. At 13, she began to hear voices. She swore they were saints. Michael, Catherine, Margaret, commanding her to save France from ruin. Imagine being that age. The world telling you to obey, to stay small. And instead you hear the summons of heaven itself. France at that time was in tatters. The 100 Years' War with England had hollowed the land. Villages burned, crops stolen, families scattered. The French king, Charles VII, was mocked as the king of Bourges, barely holding on to scraps of his realm. People longed for a sign, a miracle, anything. And then came Joan. Do you see how dangerous that is? A teenage girl claiming divine orders, stepping into a world of men and power. Some saw her as a prophet, others as madness embodied. Even I, reading her story now, waver between awe and unease. Could she truly have been guided by heaven? Or was it the sheer force of conviction that made others believe? And yet, history is not kind to hesitation. Joan did not hesitate. With nothing but her voices and an iron certainty, she left Domremy. She cut her hair short, dressed in men's clothing, and rode to seek the Dauphin, Charles. I sometimes wonder, what did her mother think? To watch her daughter leave, knowing she might never return. I remember the first time my own daughter left home, boarding a bus to the city with her suitcase and dreams. I waved. I smiled. But when the bus vanished, I wept. Because faith in our children is the bravest, Most painful kind of faith. Joan's journey to Charles was not the march of a soldier but the pilgrimage of a believer. She faced ridicule, suspicion, even threats. Yet she pressed forward, until she stood in the royal court. And here is where her story turns from the ordinary to the extraordinary. Charles tested her, hiding among his courtiers. Joan, never having seen him, walked straight to the disguised Dauphin and bowed. She had found him without error. Was it miracle, intuition, or trickery? Historians still debate. But in that moment, Charles listened. And soon, France would change. Her fire had only just been lit out. Joan's moment before the Dauphin was only the beginning. Convincing a prince was one thing. Convincing a war-torn nation was quite another. France had grown weary of promises. And yet, when this young woman, clad in armor too heavy for her shoulders, lifted a banner painted with the lilies of France, soldiers followed. Perhaps they followed her faith more than her orders. Perhaps they needed to believe that heaven itself had not abandoned them. I imagine the clamor of an army camp. The clink of metal. The smell of smoke. Men swearing and sharpening their blades. Into that noise walked Joan. Barely 5 feet tall. Her hair cropped like a boy's. Her voice clear as a church bell. She did not curse. She did not boast. She prayed. And somehow, they listened. Her greatest test came at Orléans in 1429. The city had been under English siege for months. Its people were starving. Morale had sunk into despair. Charles dared not send his full might. But Joan begged for command. It was madness. Many thought. A teenage peasant girl leading hardened men into battle? But she pressed. And Charles yielded. Here, history becomes almost theatrical. Picture the gates of Orléans thrown open at dawn. Joan rides in. Her banner catching the light. Citizens cheer. Soldiers rally. She does not lift a sword. She carries only her standard. Yet she marches to the front lines. Arrows hissing through the air. At one point she was struck. Wounded. But she returned. Bloodied yet unbroken. And within days, Orléans was freed. That victory changed everything. France, once mocked, found its heartbeat again. Joan became not just a commander but a symbol. Songs were sung of her. Stories whispered that she could not be killed. That she bore God's own shield. And Charles, hesitant Charles, saw the chance to be crowned at Reims. In the ancient Cathedral of Kings. Ah! Coronations. They always feel like theater. Don't they? I once attended a graduation ceremony where my granddaughter received her diploma. The cap and gown. The stage. The applause. It wasn't royalty. But it carried the same ritual weight. I remember tearing up. Not because of the paper she held. But because of what it meant. Recognition. Legitimacy. That's what Joan gave Charles. At Reims. 1429. She stood beside him as the crown was lowered onto his head. Without her, he might never have been king in truth. But power has sharp edges. The same miracle that lifts you can cut you down. Charles, secure now, began to drift from Joan. She was no longer convenient. Worse, she grew bolder, urging further campaigns, pressing into dangerous ground. And for every believer, there was a skeptic, whispering. A witch. A heretic. A girl led not by saints but by devils. This is the cruelty of history. Heroes are raised up, only to be broken when their presence becomes troublesome. And perhaps that's why her story haunts me most. Because how often do we see it even now? Brave souls who stand against the current, only to be abandoned when the tide shifts. Her capture came in 1430, at Compiègne. Betrayal played its hand. Gates closed behind her. Allies withdrew. And she was dragged down from her horse. She was sold to the English, paraded like a prize. And then the trials began. Imagine the loneliness of that cell. Cold stone. Iron bars. No friendly faces. The voices she once trusted must have echoed differently there. I think of nights in my own bed. The silence so heavy I turn to the empty pillow beside me, half expecting an answer that will never come. Loneliness eats at certainty. It can make even saints doubt themselves. Did Joan doubt? The records say she wavered, confessed, then recanted, clung once more to her vision. Her judges were not seeking truth. They were seeking to destroy her. They twisted words, accused her of witchcraft, of dressing as a man, of pride. It was a trial designed to end one way. At the stake. I wonder. Did she know? Did she feel the inevitability pressing down like a storm? When I lost my husband, I remember that same helplessness. Sitting by his hospital bed. The machines humming. The doctors murmuring in the hallway. The knowledge that no prayer, no bargaining, could turn back what was coming. Perhaps Joan, too, felt that crushing inevitability. And yet, when the day came, she did not falter. But that, my dear listeners, is for the next part of our journey. The morning of May 30th, 1431. Rouen. The square was already thick with people. The air heavy with smoke from torches. They had come not merely to watch, but to witness the undoing of a miracle. A teenage girl who had once lifted a kingdom now stood condemned as a heretic. Joan of Arc, 19 years old, was led to the stake. The accounts say she asked for a cross. A soldier, perhaps moved, fashioned one quickly from 2 bits of wood and handed it to her. She pressed it to her chest as though it were the last warmth in the world. Another priest brought the processional cross from the cathedral, holding it high so her eyes could cling to it. Even in that moment, bound, betrayed, she prayed. The crowd was not silent. Some jeered. Others wept. The English wanted her dead. But the French in Rouen, many of them must have trembled at what they were seeing. For what if this was not the death of a witch, but the martyrdom of a saint? Flames rose, crackling and spitting, swallowing her figure. Witnesses wrote that her voice carried even as the smoke choked her lungs. She called on Jesus until she could call no more. When the fire consumed her, many swore they saw a dove rise into the air. Was it truth? Was it wishful imagination? History leaves us with fragments, uncertain and aching. Afterwards, her ashes were scattered into the Seine, as though the river might wash away her memory. But memory clings. It seeped into the soil of France, into the whispers of peasants, into the heart of a people who could not forget the girl who had once dared to believe. As I picture that square in Rouen, I feel a chill. Not from the fire, but from the loneliness. To die surrounded by thousands, and yet to be utterly alone. That is a solitude deeper than any I have known. Or perhaps, not entirely. When my husband passed, I sat by his side as he took his last breath, my hand clutching his. The room was full of machines, but it felt empty. Death has a way of making the world fall away until it is only you and the inevitable. Did Joan feel abandoned? Or did she truly feel the presence of her saints in that final instant? Perhaps that is what gave her strength to endure what no child should. History did not leave her in silence. 25 years later, in 1456, her trial was retried. The same church that condemned her reversed its judgment, declaring her innocent, declaring her a martyr. Centuries later, in 1920, she was canonized as a saint by the Catholic Church. From witch to saint, from ashes to halo. What an arc! It makes me think. How fragile is truth? How easily it is bent, reshaped, reinterpreted to suit power. In life, Joan was a heretic. In death, a savior. What will history make of us? I wonder. When centuries smooth over the jagged edges of our choices. As for Joan, she has become more than flesh and bone ever could. A statue in stone. A name in textbooks. A rallying cry. Yet behind all that is still the girl. Barefoot. Dark-haired. Listening to voices in the quiet of a village night. Perhaps we must remember her not as myth. Not as saint. But as a lonely young woman who believed enough to change the course of nations. And so, her ghost lingers. Not just in Rouen. Not just in France. But wherever courage meets cruelty. I think she lingers in my own room at times. When the night presses too heavy. When loss feels unbearable. I recall her fire. Both the literal and the figurative. It tells me that even in the bleakest moment, belief can blaze. But history never lets us rest long. For every flame that lights the sky, shadows gather. And the shadows of Joan's story continue to haunt France for centuries after her death. France after Joan was like a battlefield after smoke clears. Charred. Uncertain. Waiting to see what remained. Her ashes had been flung into the Seine. But her story did not vanish. It lingered in whispers. In tavern songs. In the hushed prayers of villagers who dared not speak too loud. The 100 Years' War still raged. Charles VII had been crowned. Thanks in part to Joan's victories. But France was fractured. Tired. Poor. The English held swaths of land. Burgundians watched with cold calculation. And in the shadows, the ghost of Joan haunted both victors and betrayers. I imagine those who betrayed her, sitting in their chambers by candlelight, staring into the flame. Did they feel her eyes? Did her prayers echo in their ears? Conscience can be a crueler judge than any tribunal. History gives us glimpses. Guillaume d'Estivet, one of her prosecutors, died suddenly in an outhouse. Mocked as divine justice. Pierre Cauchon, the bishop who led the trial, never escaped suspicion. His name drips with infamy even today. It makes me wonder. When we act against truth, does history eventually devour us? Or do only some names rot, while others slip away unnoticed? The French people began to murmur. If Joan had been condemned unjustly, what did that mean for their faith, their king, their church? These were dangerous thoughts, but irresistible. By 1456, the retrial was convened. Not by Joan's enemies, but by her family, her village priest, and sympathetic clergy. They gathered testimony from over 100 witnesses. Farmers spoke of her piety. soldiers of her courage, villagers of her honesty. Even enemies admitted grudging respect. And so, the church reversed itself. Joan was declared innocent. Think of the irony. The same institution that burned her now sought to cleanse itself of the stain. Too late for her body, but not for her memory. That retrial was as much about politics as it was about truth. Charles VII needed his legitimacy to rest not on a witch, but on a sainted savior. The lesson? History often bends not toward justice, but toward convenience. And yet, in bending, it sometimes creates justice by accident. When I read those old testimonies, I see ordinary voices. A shepherd who remembered her kindness. A soldier who recalled her bravery. A neighbor who saw her at prayer. They remind me of funerals I've attended. How, when someone passes, everyone becomes a witness. We piece together fragments, trying to grasp the essence of the departed. Sometimes, the fragments glow brighter in death than they did in life. I think about my own late husband. After his passing, neighbors told me stories of him fixing their fence, carrying groceries, little things I never knew. It made me smile and ache. Memory becomes a prism. Truth refracted, but also illuminated. Joan's prism expanded until she was no longer just a girl from Domremy, but a symbol of France itself. Over time, monarchists, Republicans, Catholics, and even secularists claimed her. She became everything. Martyr, patriot, saint, feminist icon, nationalist banner. How curious that a teenage girl could be stretched across centuries of meaning. But before we drift too far, let me ask you, what is it we want from heroes? Do we want them flawless, or broken like us? Do we want them as people, or as legends? Joan was flesh and blood, with doubts and fears. Yet history painted her as iron. Perhaps we need both. The vulnerable human and the unyielding myth. Her canonization in 1920 cemented the myth. But even that act came in the shadow of war. World War I had torn Europe apart. France needed a saint, a unifying flame. And Joan, centuries gone, still burned. Sometimes I wonder if the ghosts of history are not the people themselves, but the roles we force them to play. Over and over. Long after their voices are gone. Joan is trapped forever between fire and halo. And maybe, so are we. In smaller ways. Even after the retrial, Joan's ghost refused to rest quietly. For centuries she has appeared again and again. Like a candle relit each time France trembled in darkness. During the French Revolution, radicals lifted her up as a symbol of the people's fight against tyranny. In the 19th century, monarchists claimed her as proof of divine right. In the 20th, Republicans painted her as the voice of liberty. Even feminists, marching for their rights, found inspiration in this teenage girl who wore armor and defied men. It fascinates me how one life can be pulled in so many directions. Joan never asked to be anyone's symbol. She simply said she was obeying God. But history, greedy as it is, devoured her, digested her, and spat out 1,000 versions. Was she saint, soldier, witch, rebel, puppet, heroine? Perhaps she was all, and none. Her canonization in 1920 felt like the closing of a circle. But even then, it was less about her than about France. The First World War had left scars. Soldiers at Verdun clutched medallions of Joan, whispering her name as shells exploded around them. When she was declared a saint, it was as if the nation was reaching for a mother, a protector. I imagine mothers sending sons to the front with her image sewn into their coats, like a shield against despair. Yet saints are complicated things. Once sanctified, they are less flesh and more marble. I sometimes feel uneasy with that. Joan was young, human, trembling at times. To make her only a saint is to freeze her. And I wonder, when we polish away the dirt of humanity, do we also erase what made them extraordinary in the first place? When I think of Joan, I see contradictions. A warrior who wept for the dead. A visionary who still had to struggle with doubt. A peasant who stood taller than kings. And in those contradictions, I think we glimpse why she endures. She was both fragile and unbreakable. In my own solitude, I often turn these thoughts over. There are evenings I sit by the window, listening to the wind creak through the trees, and I imagine Joan in her prison cell. Did she feel utterly alone? Or did she sense that her footsteps would echo far beyond stone walls? Some historians still argue. Was she truly guided by visions? Or was she a clever girl with extraordinary resolve? Did her faith ignite her courage? Or did her courage create her faith? These debates may never end. But perhaps that's the point. Joan lives in the questions, not in the answers. And so, dear listener, I leave you with one of those questions tonight. When we remember figures like Joan of Arc, are we honoring their lives? Or simply constructing mirrors for our own hopes and fears? Symbols linger, but the living heart of Joan's story beats in her humanity. Tonight, I want to walk slowly into that space. The quiet between myth and memory. Where we glimpse her as a girl, not a monument. Joan was born in Domremy, a little village hardly marked on maps. Imagine it. Cottages with smoke rising from low chimneys. The smell of damp earth. Sheep bleating in the hills. She was no princess. No scholar. She knew hunger. Mud. The ache of toil. I often picture her mending clothes by firelight. Her calloused hands threading a needle. Perhaps she hummed a tune she'd heard from her mother. Can you imagine that same girl, years later, leading men into battle? Her visions, whether divine or born from fierce imagination, arrived when she was barely more than a child. How heavy must it be to carry a message from heaven when your shoulders have barely carried buckets of water? And yet she bore it. With every step, she faced disbelief, mockery, even cruelty. Still, she pressed forward. Sometimes, as I sit alone at my kitchen table, I envy her certainty. I struggle with doubts every day. Doubts about whether my voice matters. Whether these evenings I spend whispering into the microphone reach anyone's heart. Joan, by contrast, never seemed to question her mission. Or perhaps she did. In the dark. When no one was watching. Maybe faith is not the absence of doubt but the courage to keep walking despite it. Her trial revealed this raw humanity. We remember the grandeur of her defiance. Refusing to bow. Insisting her voices came from God. But I find the quieter exchanges even more moving. When they questioned her about her simple dresses, her speech, her village life, she answered with plain honesty. There was no artifice. She did not craft speeches for effect. She spoke as she lived. Direct, stubborn, sincere. And yet, in the end, she broke. We must not forget that. Under threat of fire, she signed a confession. For a moment, she bent. Some say it was weakness. Others say it was wisdom, an attempt to save her life. But I see it as proof she was human. To tremble at the thought of burning is not failure. It is the beating of a heart that longed, still, to live. Her return to defiance, her reclaiming of her truth, is what makes her story extraordinary. She could not deny herself. Faced with death, she chose truth over survival. And that is why the flames, though they consumed her body, could not consume her legacy. I often ask myself, if I were in her place, would I have had her courage? Alone in my little home, with the night pressing close, I know my answer is no. But perhaps that is why we need stories like hers. They remind us of what is possible, even in the weakest of us. Dear listener, as you rest tonight, I leave you with this thought. Courage may not always roar. Sometimes it whispers. Sometimes it is no more than a trembling voice that says, I will not deny what I believe. When dawn broke over Rouen on that May morning in 1431, the streets swelled with people. Men, women, even children, drawn like moths to the terrible spectacle, crowded the square. They had come to see Joan die. The air must have been thick with smoke. Not yet from the fire, but from the torches of soldiers holding back the crowd. I find myself shuddering when I imagine it. Have you ever stood in a square where history itself seemed to echo in the stones? I did. Once. Years ago in a small French town. The walls still bore the faint marks of fire. Black scars that never seemed to wash away. I remember pressing my palm against the cold stone and thinking, how many lives, how many stories, had ended right there. Joan's death was one such story. Tragic, luminous, unforgettable. They brought her out in a plain dress, stripped of armor, stripped of dignity. No crown of laurels, no swelling hems. Just a young woman, her hands bound, her eyes searching the horizon. What must she have seen in that moment? Not just the faces of her accusers, but also those of the villagers who once cheered her. Did she wonder if she had failed them? Or did she cling to the belief that even this final act was part of her divine mission? As the stake was raised, she asked for a cross. A kind-hearted priest lifted one high so she could see it through the flames. Some say she murmured the name of Jesus until the fire stole her breath. I cannot tell you whether that is true. But the image has haunted me ever since I first read it as a schoolgirl. The notion of faith carried to the last breath. It pierces my heart. The flames leapt higher. They say the crowd fell silent. It is hard to picture silence in the middle of such horror. But perhaps it was not silence at all. Perhaps it was the sound of awe. The hush that comes when humanity witnesses something greater than itself. And then it was over. The girl from Domremy, the maid of Orléans, was gone. Or was she? Her ashes may have been scattered. But stories travel farther than smoke. Within decades, whispers of her holiness grew. Centuries later, the Church declared her a saint. Nations invoked her name in battle. Artists painted her. Poets sang her. Filmmakers captured her fire. She became more than a martyr. She became a mirror. A mirror for courage. For faith. For the unyielding spirit that refuses to be silenced. Sometimes, when I sit alone by candlelight, I feel that same mirror reflecting me. Not because I am brave, but because I am small. And Joan reminds us that even the smallest among us can change the world. But here is the great question that lingers. Was she a saint, guided by divine voices? Or a girl caught in the tides of politics and faith, consumed by forces too great for her to resist? History cannot answer. But perhaps that is the point. Her mystery is what keeps her alive in our hearts. So tonight, my dear listener, as you close your eyes, remember this. Joan's fire was not just an ending. It was a beginning. A spark carried across centuries, burning still in every story told about her. The silence after Joan's death did not last long. As soon as her ashes cooled, the debates began. Some whispered that she had been a witch, others that she had been a prophetess. But no one could deny that she had shaken the kingdoms of Europe. Even her enemies, those who had condemned her, could not erase the memory of her voice echoing on the battlefield. I often think about how memory works. When I sit in my quiet kitchen at night, the clock ticking on the wall, I wonder, who decides which stories are remembered and which are forgotten? Joan's tale was not written by her own hand. It was carried by others. Priests, soldiers, peasants, scholars. Each with their own bias, their own version of events. And yet, somehow, her spirit emerges, shining through the distortions like a figure glimpsed through stained glass. The decades rolled on, and the 100 Years' War lumbered toward its end. France, fractured and exhausted, finally began to heal. Charles VII, the very king Joan had lifted to his throne, never moved to pardon her in his lifetime. That always struck me as both tragic and telling. Did he feel guilt? Did he fear reopening old wounds? Or was it easier for a king to leave the girl who saved him in the shadows of history, while he basked in the light of his crown? It was not until nearly 25 years later, in 1456, that the Church itself retried her case. This time, witnesses came forward not as enemies but as defenders. Farmers from Domremy, soldiers who had marched with her, even clergy. All spoke of her purity, her faith, her bravery. And the verdict was overturned. Joan of Arc was declared innocent, her name cleansed of heresy. Imagine that. Condemned at 19. Vindicated only after death. What a cruel twist of justice. This part of her story always makes me pause. How many of us will be misunderstood in our lifetimes, only to be truly seen when we are gone? It is a sobering thought. As I sit here, alone with my tea cooling on the table, I sometimes wonder if my own life will be remembered, or forgotten like the dust on my bookshelf. Perhaps that is why Joan's story resonates so deeply with me. She was silenced, yet history would not let her vanish. Centuries later, the Church went further still. In 1920, Joan was canonized as a saint. The girl who once frightened priests and kings became the patron saint of France. Her feast day is celebrated on May 30th, the very day she was burned. Life has such ironies, doesn't it? A day of horror transformed into a day of veneration. Her image continues to shift with each generation. To the French, she is a symbol of national pride. To the faithful, she is a saint of unwavering devotion. To feminists, she is a heroine who defied patriarchal chains. To some, she is even a military icon, embodying strategy, courage, and the power of belief. And yet, I always return to the same haunting thought. Beneath all the titles, saint, warrior, martyr. She was still just a girl. A teenager with visions. With courage. With fear. And maybe that is what makes her timeless. Because every era, every listener, can find a piece of themselves in Joan. Joan's story, of course, did not end with canonization. In some ways, that was only the beginning of her second life. Her life as a symbol, a myth, a rallying cry. And you know, my dears, symbols are often more powerful than flesh and bone. In the centuries that followed, her image was painted, sculpted, sung, and dramatized. Great cathedrals set her likeness in stained glass. Poets wrote verses in her honor. And yet, she was never a simple figure to pin down. During the French Revolution, both royalists and republicans tried to claim her. She was used as a banner for monarchs, and also as a beacon for the common people rising against those very monarchs. Isn't it strange how one life can be stretched and reshaped, like clay, to fit such different purposes? In the 19th and 20th centuries, her myth grew even larger. Writers like Voltaire dismissed her as deluded, while others, romanticists and nationalists, raised her as a pure embodiment of France. Even Napoleon found use for her memory, presenting himself as the heir to her vision of a united France. By the time she was declared a saint, she had already been reborn a dozen times in the minds of men. And then came the wars of the modern era. World War I saw her invoked as a guardian of French soldiers, a spirit marching beside them in the trenches. Posters carried her image, urging courage and sacrifice. During World War II, she was again divided. The Vichy regime used her as a symbol of traditional values, while the resistance held her up as a patron of rebellion against oppression. Imagine that. One woman, centuries dead, able to inspire both collaboration and defiance. I sit back sometimes and shake my head at the way history works. A lonely widow like me can fade from memory without a ripple, while Joan, who lived only 19 short years, continues to ignite fires across centuries. But then, perhaps that is the nature of martyrdom. When the body is burned, the legend rises from the smoke. What fascinates me most is how she belongs to everyone and no one. A saint to the devout. A feminist icon to the modern world. A patriot to the nationalists. A rebel to the oppressed. She cannot be fully possessed. And maybe that is her power. She slips from the hands of those who would own her and reappears in new guises, ready to speak to the next generation. And this raises a question, doesn't it? If life can mean so many things to so many people, what is its true meaning? Was Joan meant to be France's savior? God's servant? A young woman who simply believed so fiercely that she bent history around her? Historians will keep arguing. Priests will keep preaching. Artists will keep imagining. But for me, alone in my small home, I find comfort in thinking that she was simply human, brave, flawed, inspired, and very much alive in her brief, burning moment. As the centuries have rolled on, Joan of Arc has become less a person and more a mirror. Each age, each people, each ideology gazes into her life and sees what they wish to see. And yet, I find myself thinking of her not as the blazing saint in armor, nor the political banner waved in revolutions, but as the girl, just 19, trembling, stubborn, hearing voices in the silence of her prayers. In my quiet house, the evenings stretch long. Sometimes the walls echo with memories of my husband, and sometimes with nothing at all. Loneliness is a strange battlefield, my dears. It can be as fierce as any English sword, as consuming as fire. And when I think of Joan, alone in her cell, stripped of friends, mocked by judges, betrayed by kings, well, my heart aches for her in ways that no history book quite captures. I know what it feels like to sit with only your thoughts, and to wonder if the world has forgotten you. But then, she was never forgotten. She burned. Yes. But she lit a flame that refused to die. And isn't that the paradox of suffering? Out of her agony, millions have drawn courage. Out of her humiliation, countless have found pride. Out of her silencing, voices have been raised in freedom. Sometimes, when I look out my little window at the moon, I imagine Joan standing there beside me, gazing at the same pale light she must have seen before her final dawn. I picture her whispering, not to armies or kings, but to me. And perhaps to you too. Do not be afraid to stand alone. If it is for what is right. It makes me wonder, quietly, what voices do we listen to in our lives? Are they whispers of truth? Or echoes of fear? History cannot answer that for us. It only offers the example of those who dared to listen and act. So, my dear listeners, as we close tonight, take Joan with you. Not just as the saint or the soldier, but as the human being who dared to live fully in her short span. Let her remind you that even the smallest of us, in the loneliest hour, can still leave behind a light. And so, as the story of Joan fades into the hush of night, let us hold her not as a figure frozen in time, but as a companion for our own journeys. She was not perfect. She was not unbreakable. She was a young woman who laughed, who wept, who prayed, and who faced death with a heart that still beat with belief. In that, she is closer to us than the statues and stained glass might suggest. History is full of ghosts, but not all are frightening. Some reach out to comfort us, to remind us that our struggles are not new, that loneliness, courage, betrayal, and faith have walked with humankind for centuries. Joan's voice, carried through fire and silence, still murmurs to those willing to hear. So tonight, as you drift into sleep, may her story be a lantern at your bedside. A soft glow reminding you that even in the darkest hours, belief and bravery can rise. Let your dreams be filled with her banner fluttering in the wind, her voice clear against the din of battle, her spirit unbroken even in defeat.